Imagine, if you will, you live in 1970s England and you want to buy yourself a folding bicycle.
Bickerton. Bickerton.
Well, there's not that many options, and what there are not that great. They're either slow, heavy, cumbersome when folded, or all three of those things. This is the world where Harry Bickerton found himself in. In 1970, he was handed a 3-year suspension on his license for a rather nasty drunk driving accident, and he needed a new way to get around. Wasn't happy with the folding bikes that existed at the time, and he went into his garage and started building a prototype for what would become this. He was an aircraft engineer by trade, so he was very familiar with aluminium, and he knew the benefits of what it could bring to bicycles and cycling in general. By 1971, he had a bike that was ready for production. He had come up with a complete prototype that was basically ready to go. We'll get back to how that turned out, but let's look at the bike, shall we? It was truly innovative for its day. The bike was completely aluminium. It's entirely bolted or riveted together. There's not a single weld on the original bike. The way he got around the difficulties of welding aluminum was simply not to weld anything. The pedal on the left hand unthreads with a clever little latch on it. The wheel on the front is smaller than the rear one, which means that when folded, the handlebars are able to get lower. This is about as small as a Brompton, which is a bike that didn't enter production for another 10 years after this was designed. That all sounds amazing, so why aren't we all riding Bickertons around right now? It did have some rather serious downsides. The biggest one was due to its all aluminum construction and the way it folded, it was very, very flexible. The handlebars were flexy, the seat post very flexible. The main box section, while light and relatively stiff, was not as stiff as it probably should have been. This, coupled with some odd choices such as the mismatched wheels, led to a bike that has been maybe affectionately or not so much called the Rickerton by people who owned it. But how bad is it really? Well, let's take this one for a ride and we'll find out.
Bickerton.
And it rides both better and worse than what people say about it. When you're riding along a flat trail like this, it's really actually fine. It's relatively comfortable, it handles fine, but the second you need to put a bit of extra pressure through the pedals, it falls apart pretty quickly. The bike has a huge amount of flex in it. The handlebars probably move 25 centimeters side to side. It's not an exaggeration. The seat post and mainframe are also pretty flexy. Imagine if you were to try to take this bike over about 15 kilometers an hour, it would be a bit more of a death wish than a fun time. The small wheel on the front means the steering is really light, and that's some rather odd steering geometry as well. At speed, it basically feels like the front end is floating. That, coupled with the somewhat indistinct feel coming from the rest of the bike, means that it is a little bit scary. I have heard the Bickerton described as riding a unicycle with reins, and it's not entirely incorrect. Maybe not quite that bad. There's a bit of an urban legend, or possibly it might be true, is that Andrew Ritchie, the founder of Brompton, bought one of these bikes because he loved the idea and the innovation behind it. But then once he rode it and realized how, terrible the ride quality was, it inspired him to build his own bike, which then became the Brompton. I can't say I disagree with his logic on either of those decisions or comments. With that being said, it does ride. This is a functional bicycle. At the time, this was better than what was really available from a lot of other companies. This could fit in the boot of a Mini. There wasn't that many other bikes that could do that and be as functional as this. Or maybe, I don't even know if there was another one that could.
Bickerton. Bickerton.
Now, the story of the Bickerton's production is almost as crazy as riding the Bickerton itself. So, in 1971, he had a working prototype basically ready for production. He set up a factory and started to produce bikes. By 1972, the bikes were being produced in a serial but small amount. In the first 2 years of production, only about 300 units per year were made. But this changed in 1974 when he sold the build license to a company called TCK Group, a heavy industries group out of the UK that wanted to diversify. They ramped up production to over 1,000 units per year, and it came at exactly the right time. The 1970s oil crisis meant that there was a heavy demand for little bikes like this, and they were able to capitalize on that. They produced print and television ads that really put the bike into the popular conscience. But the good times couldn't last. The recession that followed the oil crisis, coupled with a strong pound, meant that there was very little demand in the UK, and abroad it was not profitable to export anymore, which meant that in 1977 the TCK Group folded and the build license reverted back to Harry Bickerton. However, it wouldn't stay out of production for long. He sold the rights to an Australian company that set up shop right here in Melbourne. That's where this one was made, which started production, and they were able to capitalize on it quite well. They built the bike in kit form, which they shipped to other countries to minimize labor and shipping costs. It was distributed all over the world. They were able to produce over 50,000 bikes here in Australia. However, they also ran into financial issues. They were unable to keep up with their royalty payments, and in 1982, Bickerton cancelled their agreement and the build license reverted back to the UK. This time around, he wanted to do things a little bit differently. He set up shop with a person called Steve Rolson, who he used to work with at TCK Group. They had the Bickerton-Rolson Group, and initially, demand was strong. The bike was still selling well, and they were able to have a very good domestic market. But the writing was really on the wall for Bickerton at this point. The bike they had gotten back from Australia was pretty dated, and by the mid-80s, other bikes were starting to really eat into the Bickerton market share. Originally, the Bickerton's issues, its poor ride quality, cumbersome folded setup, and questionable parts, were never really that much of a problem because a lot of the other bikes had either equally bad or worse setups. There was nothing that was the same weight and size as the Bickerton. But the developments in the Bickerton had made it heavier and other bikes had gotten better. Namely, the Brompton had come out, which was the same size as a Bickerton, but it was able to ride much more like a standard bike. This started to really cut into the Bickerton's market share, and there was not much they could do. They had waited far too long to redesign the bike. They did try to upgrade and change the original design slightly. There was a 20-inch wheeled version. There was other gearing options. They were all tried out, but ultimately it was too little too late. Their last-ditch effort was to apply for a research and development grant from the UK government. This would allow them to invest money into building a composite Bickerton. It would be of a similar design, but instead of an aluminium frame, it would be composite. They could make things much stiffer and lighter, potentially. They received the grant of almost £40,000, and they started working on it. However, composite technology was just not there in the late 80s. They did not have what they needed to, and eventually that ended up going nowhere. Instead of a lifeline for Bickerton, this ended up being the final nail in the coffin. Bickerton ceased serial production in 1989, and although the factory did continue to run for a little bit beyond that, the factory was shut in 1991. And that was it. The original Bickerton design was no more. The Bickerton name brand did survive. His son licensed it out and builds rebadged Dahons, which you can still buy today. It makes you wonder, like, this was a potentially good design. I can't help but like this bike, even though it's objectively a poor product. Like, it's got a certain quirkiness that it's hard to deny. Maybe it's the different sized wheels, maybe it's the weird ride quality, but I can't help but feel like if this bike was developed properly and early enough, maybe it could be a real competitor to some of the modern folding bikes. And it's a shame that it never got to see that side of it. I mean, maybe there's an alternative world where we all ride Bickertons instead of Bromptons, Birdies, and Dahons. I mean, probably not, but maybe. Anyways, thanks for watching. See you next time.